Warning: the following video contains explicit language which may be offensive to some viewers or inappropriate for children. The content within this video is intended for mature audiences only.
Here's an update on Abrego Garcia and what's going to happen with him or not.
Be returned, that you would abide by that. You said that on Air Force One just a few days ago, and they said, do you plan to return him?
Well, I'm supposed to have suggested that I smuggle terrorists into the United States, right?
It's always
how can I smuggle? How can I return him to the United States? Like, I smuggle him into the United States, or what do I do? Of course, I'm not going to do it. It's like, I mean, the question is preposterous. How can I smuggle a terrorist into the United States? I don't have the power to return him to the United States.
But you could release him inside El Salvador.
Yeah, but I'm not releasing. I mean, we're not very fond of releasing terrorists into our country. I mean, we just turned the murder capital of the world into the safest country of the Western Hemisphere, and you want us to go back into the releasing criminals so we can go back to being the murder capital of the world? No, that's not going to happen.
Well, they'd love to have a criminal, released into our
country. I mean, there's a fascination.
They would love it.
Yeah,
they're sick. These are sick people.
The quote-unquote terrorist that they were referring to there is Kilmar Abrego Garcia, and he's not a terrorist. He is an innocent man who's a father of 3 and a husband from Maryland with no criminal record, yet he was sent to a gulag in El Salvador by mistake. The Trump administration called his deportation an administrative error and even acknowledged that he was protected from deportation because of a 2019 court order. So, no, Abrego Garcia is not a terrorist, and the president of El Salvador, Bukele, who you heard from there, can easily release him like that if he wanted to, and Trump can simply look over and tell him, hey, release him, and he would comply. But neither of these men want to release him, even though they admitted that he ended up in a gulag because of their fuck-up. But on April 10th, in a unanimous Supreme Court decision, they upheld a lower court's ruling that ordered the Trump administration to bring him back, writing, the lower court's order properly requires the government to facilitate Abrego Garcia's release from custody in El Salvador and to ensure that his case is handled as it would have been handled had he not been improperly sent to El Salvador. The intended scope of the term effectuate in the district court's order is, however, unclear and may exceed the district court's authority. The district court should clarify its directive with due regard for the deference owed to the executive branch in the conduct of foreign affairs. For its part, the government should be prepared to share what it can concerning the steps it has taken and the prospect of further steps. In other words, the Supreme Court is saying that the lower court was right to order the government to facilitate his release since his deportation was illegal, and the Trump administration should explain the steps that they're taking to do just that. Now, if they still want to deport him, technically they can do that, but they're required to do it the right way and give him due process. However, the Supreme Court also says that the lower court needs to explain what it meant by effectuate, since the court can't tell the executive branch how to get a foreign government to do something because courts don't have jurisdiction over foreign policy, and Abrego Garcia's attorney explained what that meant in simple terms.
The decision confirms that the government needs to facilitate, but asks the lower court to clarify what it meant when it said that the U.S. government should effectuate. And that's just a reference to the limits of the U.S. government's power to control the actions of a foreign sovereign here, El Salvador. So it may take some time. The bottom line is that it may take some time because, of course, the U.S. government cannot order another government to do anything now that it has put Mr. Abrego Garcia in this position. But it is still a step in the right direction and hopefully will lead to his return home to his family, or at least, unfortunately, to immigration detention in the United States while the the government works out its theory for why he should be removed, even though he received legal protection in the past.
So a court can tell the Trump administration to do something, but can't tell them how to do it. But the lower court judge, who the Supreme Court agreed with, by the way, issued a new order clarifying her requirements as requested by the Supreme Court. And NPR explains Judge Zinnes issued a new order directing the federal government to take all available steps to facilitate the return of Abrigo Garcia to the United States as soon as possible. And she ordered the Justice Department to provide an immediate update on his location and status, what steps the government has taken so far to bring him back, and what additional steps it is considering. Now, in her previous order, she specifically said that the Trump administration should facilitate and effectuate the return of Abrigo Garcia, but after the Supreme Court weighed in and said that effectuate wasn't clear enough, she clarified, and she leaned in on that word facilitate and said that she's basically now ordering the Trump administration to bring him back, but she's not saying how they have to bring him back, but she is requiring them to tell her what they're doing to facilitate his return, which is something that she can do as confirmed by the Supreme Court. Now, if it feels like I'm being unnecessarily technical or meticulous, I am, but the context is necessary so you can understand just how egregious the Trump administration's lies are in defying these orders. The excuses that they make are completely bogus. Now, to be clear, a judge asking an administration to provide them, to provide her in particular, with regard to Judge Zinnes, information about how they're going to comply with her order is not an unreasonable ask. It's very simple, as explained by law professor James Sample, but they're still refusing to comply with even the bare minimum.
We're asking so little. She is asking so little of the government, and they are still...
With the unanimous backing of the Supreme Court of the United States.
Absolutely. And in fact, not just 9 justices of the Supreme Court, but all 13 federal judges who have looked at this matter have ruled in the exact same way, rejecting the government's fundamental proposition here, which is the government's fundamental proposition is, yeah, we made a mistake. So what? Tough luck. On to the next. All 13 judges, including the district court judge, Paul Zinnes, including 3 judges on the Fourth Circuit, and all 9 justices of the Supreme Court reject the government's position, and yet the government is still resisting, even as to that little modicum of information that you mentioned.
So in layman's terms, the judge, with the full backing of the Supreme Court, mind you, is ordering them to bring him back and asking what they're doing to comply with her order to bring him back, and their answer is basically, fuck you. That's not specifically verbatim what they said, but in not so many words, they're making it clear that they're not going to comply. The only piece of information that they gave to this judge was that he's alive. Everything else is privileged, according to them. And she responded in court saying, I'm not asking for state secrets. I'm asking you to explain to me what you are doing to comply with my order to bring him back after I said you must bring him back. But we're getting nothing. They still won't disclose his location or elaborate on any meaningful steps that they're taking to bring him back, or if they're even planning to bring him back at all. And thanks to that joint meeting in the Oval Office between Bukele and Trump, we now know definitively that they're refusing to comply with this judge's order and now with the Supreme Court because they have no plans to bring him back. In fact, they're telling the press that the Supreme Court ruling was actually a victory for them, not for Abrigo Garcia. And CNN's Caitlin Collins asked Trump whether or not he's going to ask Bukele to return him since he's right there, and facilitating his return would be super easy right now. Convenient, right? So he doesn't answer. Instead, he pivots to Pam Bondi, who comes up with multiple lies in the span of just a couple of seconds. And this is a lot, but we'll break it down when we come back.
Do you plan to ask President Bukele to help return the man who your administration says was mistakenly deported? The man who was mistakenly deported to El Salvador?
Well, let me ask Pam, would you answer that question?
Sure, President. First and foremost, he was illegally in our country. He had been illegally in our country. And in 2019, 2 courts, an immigration court and an appellate immigration court, ruled that he was a member of MS-13 and he was illegally in our country. Right now, it was additional paperwork had needed to be done. That's up to El Salvador if they want to return him. That's not up to us. The Supreme Court ruled, President, that if, as El Salvador wants to return him, this is international matters, foreign affairs, if they wanted to return him, we would facilitate it, meaning provide a plane.
Okay, first of all, even though he entered the country illegally, he won legal status in a court because they believed that he'd face persecution if he returned to El Salvador. Second of all, the claim that he was a member of MS-13 is a straight-up lie. As Aaron Reichlin-Melnick of the American Immigration Council explains, these were unproven allegations made during bond proceedings for him that the government wasn't required to prove. Allegations made, by the way, by ICE. Not the most trustworthy agency. Furthermore, he doesn't have a criminal record. He has no MS-13 gang tattoos to confirm his affiliation, and his wife, who's a U.S. citizen, emphatically denies that he is affiliated with any gang.
It was an administrative error as to why he was deported, and he is a known gang member. ICE testified he was a gang member, and we believe he should stay where he is.
Jennifer, what do you say to these accusations that you just heard from the Attorney General that your husband is a known gang member?
They're wrong because my husband is not a gang member. He's actually an amazing father, an amazing husband. That's who he truly is.
And the sad irony is that he fled El Salvador because of gang violence. A judge in 2019 at least temporarily said he can't be deported because he is at risk of persecution if he goes back to El Salvador. But here's the thing. If Pam Bondi actually had evidence that he was in a gang, well, then it'd be super easy to prove that in the court of law. But the fact that they're refusing to give him or anyone else sent to this gulag due process tells you that they're not too confident in their claims. And that's because their claims are bullshit. It's because they're lying. 60 Minutes couldn't find criminal records for 75% of the 238 men sent to Sikot, meaning that 179 of them are probably going to rot in that gulag for the rest of their lives, even though they are completely innocent. So they are lying about these people. But going back to Bondi's claim about facilitating his return, she suggests that that just means that they have to provide El Salvador with the plane, but they can't compel Bukele to comply. Now, that's not just an oversimplification. It is a brazen fucking lie. The president of the United States is not powerless in this situation. Neither is the president of El Salvador, who has jurisdiction over that prison. See, if Trump demands the return of Abrego Garcia, Bukele will comply. But they're making the choice to not bring him back, and that's why they're refusing to comply. And they're defying the courts, even though Trump said he wouldn't defy the courts, which isn't necessarily surprising since he lies all the time. But just listen to his Orwellian answer when he was asked about this.
Well, Mr. President, you said that if the Supreme Court said someone needed to be returned, that you would abide by that. You said that on Air Force One just a few days ago. And they said that it must be facilitated.
Why don't you just say, isn't it wonderful that we're keeping criminals out of our country? Why can't you just say that? Why do you go over and over? And that's why nobody watches you anymore. You know, you have no credibility. Please, go ahead.
President Trump.
Because he's not a fucking criminal. He's innocent. But Trump is basically saying, look, why won't you just believe whatever bullshit we tell you? We say he's a criminal and that's that. End of story. Accept our version of reality and never question it. And their version of reality, by the way, suggests that the Supreme Court sided unanimously in Trump's favor, not in Abrego Garcia's favor, even though if you read the 4-page document, it's very clear that that is not the case. But just listen, because this is wild to me.
And what was the ruling in the Supreme Court, Steve? Was it 9-0?
Yes, it was a 9-0.
In our favor?
In our favor, against the district court ruling, saying that no district court has the power to compel the foreign policy function of the United States. As Pam said, the ruling solely stated that if this individual, at El Salvador's sole discretion, was sent back to our country, that we could deport him a second time.
Well,
no version of this legally ends up with him ever living here because he is a citizen of El Salvador. That is the president of El Salvador. Your questions about it, per the court, can only be directed to him.
That is a level of spin that is astonishing, even for this administration. Listen, the Supreme Court ruling is 4 pages long, as I mentioned earlier. I will link to that down below if you want to read it in its entirety. It'll take you less than 5 minutes. It's very clear. You don't need a law degree or know about constitutional law to understand what they're saying. They said that a lower court can't dictate how you do it, but you do have to facilitate Abrego Garcia's return since he was deported illegally. And it's true that you could technically bring him back and deport him again. they do leave that possibility there, but they emphasize that he must be given due process, which he was not given when he was sent on a plane and sent to this gulag. And since he was denied due process in the first place, that is the reason why you have to facilitate his return, because you deported him in defiance of a court order protecting him from deportation, which demonstrates why due process is so goddamn important. But this is why Trump is deporting people under the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, because he thinks that it gives him permission to deny people due process in the same way that you would deny people due process in a time of war when martial law is declared. And even though the Supreme Court is stupidly allowing Trump to do that, they're still saying that you have to give people notice at a minimum, which obviously is impossible in practice since they don't have time or money to contest these rapid deportations, but they're at least trying to pretend like we still have due process and maintain the facade that there is law and order in this country. But in the case of Abrigo Garcia, the violation of his due process was so egregious that all 9 Supreme Court justices, including Alito and Thomas, said, yeah, actually, this was a fuck up. He was legally protected from deportation, and you deported him, and now you won't bring him back. When you get Clarence Thomas and Alito to agree that Trump went too far, that's an indication that he went too far. But Trump's administration is trying to muddy the waters by pretending like the Supreme Court vindicated them in order to obscure the reality that they are brazenly violating court orders. I mean, it's not the first one that they violated, and it's not going to be the last. And at that same press meeting, by the way, Trump broadcasted his intent to take us down an even more dangerous path.
You mentioned that you're open to deporting individuals that aren't foreign aliens but are criminals to El Salvador. Does that include potentially U.S. citizens, fully naturalized Americans?
If they're criminals and if they hit people with baseball bats over their head that happen to be 90 years old, and if they rape 87-year-old women in Coney Island, Brooklyn, yeah, that includes them. What do you think? There's a special category of person? They're as bad as anybody that comes in. We have bad ones too, and I'm all for it because we can do things with the president for less money and have great security. And we have a huge prison population. We have a huge number of prisons, and then we have the private prisons, and some are operated well, I guess, and some aren't. But he does a great job with that. We have others that we're negotiating with too. But no, if it's a homegrown criminal, I have no problem. Now, we're studying the laws right now. Pam is studying. If we can do that, that's good. And I'm talking about violent people. I'm talking about really bad people. Really bad people. Every bit as bad as the ones coming in.
Well, of course, you'd only send the bad ones to foreign gulags. Totally believable. Listen, he is deporting permanent residents like Mahmoud Khalil for being pro-Palestine. But he expects us to believe that only the most hardened criminals would be sent to foreign gulags. Listen, even if that were true, it would be completely unconstitutional. But if you believe that he's only going to target the criminals, I got a bridge to sell you, because he said that about immigrants, and we're seeing so many innocent people be sent to foreign gulags. So why would the same be true about American citizens? He's not just going to suddenly be a little bit more scrupulous in sending Americans there because they're American citizens. He doesn't give a shit about the Constitution, so nobody should believe him. And as Mark Joseph Stern put it in an article for Slate, calling this a constitutional crisis undersells the catastrophic implications of this emergency. This administration is rapidly constructing a legal framework that would allow it to abruptly disappear anyone, including natural-born U.S. citizens, to a foreign prison forever for any reason it chooses, or no reason at all. And on that note, we got audio of something Trump told Bukele, and I don't know why the video is so bad, but the audio speaks for itself. Just listen.
Yeah, I said homegrowns are next. The homegrowns built. You got to build about 5 more places.
Yeah, that's fair.
All right. It's not big enough.
No, yeah.
Come on.
Yeah, needless to say, that is alarming. Now, what's even more alarming is that Trump is cozying up to Bukele in the first place, who became a dictator by using the exact same playbook Trump is using right now. Per Freedom House, Bukele overstayed constitutional term limits for presidents and ran again and supposedly won with 85% of the vote in a flawed election. He passed electoral reforms that benefited his fascist party, and he consolidated power by declaring a state of emergency back in 2022 that, quote, led to the arbitrary arrest of more than 83,000 Salvadorians harassment and violence against government critics and journalists, and mass firings of public servants, resulting in a deterioration in freedom of expression and rule of law in the country. Sound familiar? Trump is currently considering an unconstitutional third run for the presidency, and he is signing executive orders letting the federal government, and specifically DOJ, take power away from state and local governments when it comes to elections. Meanwhile, Republicans, and 4 Democrats, by the way, passed the SAVE Act, which is a voter suppression law that could disenfranchise millions of married women. On top of that, Trump is cracking down on free speech more than any other president in modern history. He's banning government agencies from using DEI words like equity or inclusion, and he's been disappearing foreign students for criticizing Israel. He just called on his FCC chair to punish CBS for doing journalism that he disapproves of. And look, it's not as bad as Bukele yet. He presumably hasn't jailed 83,000 people, at least that we're aware of. But it won't be long until he surpasses Bukele at the rate that he's going. And like Bukele, he's denying immigrants due process and trying to come up with the most efficient deportation system imaginable. Kind of like Amazon Prime, but with humans, as border czar Tom Homan put it, which is a crazy-ass thing to say. And that includes creative new ways to get tax-paying, law-abiding immigrants to self-deport, like by declaring them dead so they lose access to their credit cards and bank accounts, as the New York Times reports. So it makes sense why Trump and Bukele get along so well, because they're pretty similar. And neither of them have an interest in letting anyone ever leave Saqqat, because as Adam Serwer put it in The Atlantic, if Abrigo Garcia returns, he could speak out about the conditions he experienced at the facility, which could have political consequences both for the Salvadorian leadership and for the Trump administration. And that makes sense. I mean, you wouldn't send them to a foreign gulag if you didn't want to torture them. Because if you send them to an ICE detention center in Louisiana, for example, you're going to have American journalists snooping around. But if you send them far away to this remote area in a foreign country that's inaccessible to journalists, of course, you can basically do whatever you want to them. You can send whoever you want there with minimal scrutiny, because it's going to be very difficult to get people there to report on the human rights abuses that are taking place. And Bukele was explaining this to Trump and basically cheering him on, saying, yeah, man, you're on the right track. That's not his words, but just listen.
And in fact, Mr. President, you have 350 million people to liberate. Yes. But to liberate 350 million people, you have to imprison some. That's the way it works, right? You cannot just, free the criminals and think crime's going to go down magically. You have to imprison them so you can liberate 350 million Americans that are asking for the end of crime and the end of terrorism. And it can be done. I mean, you're doing it already.
Great advice to a wannabe dictator from a literal dictator. So even though immigrants are currently bearing the brunt of this administration's brutality, it's obvious that Trump is laying the foundation to do the exact same thing to American citizens. The only question is when. When is he going to kick it up a notch and take things to the next level and start sending Americans to gulags? And listen, I hate to say it, but at this point, the Constitution is just no longer in effect. The protections that we've been enjoying from the Constitution are no longer guaranteed to us because of this administration. They are destroying this country and destroying our entire system of laws and norms and gaslighting us while they do it, lying to our faces at every step of the way, telling us to not believe what we're seeing with our own eyes. I mean, this is quintessential fascism, and everyone has an obligation to condemn what's happening now while you still can, because in the near future, you might get disappeared if you speak out.
So, here's the thing. To get around the Supreme Court's ruling, okay, that the lower court tells Trump that he has to bring back Garcia or facilitate it. In order to get around that, okay, he had to contact the El Salvador president and tell him, look, just say you don't want to let him go, because the Supreme Court has no jurisdiction in international affairs, okay? They cannot order, your country to bring him back. I mean, they can bitch at Trump all they want, but if Trump keeps coming back and saying, well, we can't do it because the president of El Salvador won't let us, okay? And then he deliberately has this press conference where they got the president on there saying, I'm not going to let him go, okay? In other words, see, Supreme Court, I can't do anything. My hands are tied. And so, You know what I'm saying? He's changing the narrative now, so that way he can get away with not getting Garcia back here. That's why he did what he did. This was not, you know, if he couldn't get his way with the federal court, okay, and he couldn't get his way with the Supreme Court, he was going to do some backroom deal with the El Salvador president to say, okay, you tell America that you're not going to let this guy go, okay? So that way now the narrative it shifts to El Salvador instead of Trump, and it stalls and keeps Garcia still in El Salvador at that prison down there. Okay, that was Trump's doing. You know, sidestepping the courts. He remember, he doesn't obey the courts. Trump does not obey the courts. He never has. And if he can find some way to wiggle his way out of anything in the courts, he'll find it. And this is how he's wiggling his way out of bringing that guy back. Even after admitting they made a mistake by deporting him, even after, despite what Pam Bondi said and all this, oh, we felt, you know, they said he was a criminal. If he was a criminal, then why did you come out and say it was a mistake to deport him? Okay, if he was not supposed to be in the United States, if he was an illegal, okay, why did you say it was a mistake to deport him? Don't you see their own fucking words contradicts what they're saying now? And that's why we all know, that's why everybody knows, and the press was trying to get out of him, and he won't answer. He's acting like a child, saying, well, why don't you ask about this? Or, you know, instead of answering the question, he deflects, okay? Because he knows legally he has no ground to stand on in this matter. The courts ruled against him, and he's mad. And he's trying to turn that around and say, "Oh, the Supreme Court actually ruled in my favor." Really? Explain that. Because if you read the ruling, there's nothing in there that makes it a positive for Trump. Okay, they're basically saying with a 9-0 majority, okay, so that right there, all his Republican buddies in the Supreme Court even ruled on this together with the Democrat ones. So that's not a positive thing, okay, that supports Trump. The fact that they turned against him and said, no, you got to obey that lower court judge. And now he's saying, oh no, they ruled in my favor. Okay, that's like a kid saying, yeah, I didn't steal your fucking pie, it was him. You know, I mean, it's just this childishness of Trump, because like I said, his position is indefensible. It's illegal. What he's doing is illegal because Garcia was being protected by our government since 2019. He came into this country and he asked for asylum, which he got. Okay, so technically he wasn't here illegally, and they still haven't proven that he was a gang member. You heard his wife saying, no, he's not a gang member, he's a father. He was trying to get away from the gangs in El Salvador and come here. That's why he got here and under asylum, because he was afraid they were going to come after him. Okay? He'd be persecuted, whatever the hell, okay? He wasn't a gang member. He had no tattoos, no markings, no history to show that he was involved in any criminal activity. So that Pam Bondi can't prove this shit about, oh, they said he was a criminal and he was into gangs and stuff. Well, that's funny, because there's no proof of that. And if there was, why are they being so glib? You know, why are they trying to avoid answering questions directly? All she could do right now to prove her mouth is just to release the information that they have about this guy that shows he's a criminal. Release it. You want to prove you're right? Release the information. Give it to the media. Let them take it. But you just saw 60 Minutes investigated all the people that were deported, and they said about 75% of them had no fucking criminal record. 75%. So what does that tell you? ICE was out there rounding up people based on the color of their skin and a tattoo that they mistakenly thought was a gang tattoo. Okay? But none of these people were given due process, and if they had, a lot of them would not have been deported, and that's what Trump didn't want. Okay, remember, 20 fucking million, that's the number he's got in his fucking head that ICE has to meet. Because in his mind, he thinks there's 20 million illegals in this country, and it's already been proven that there's less than half that in America, if there's any like that, okay? Especially if half of them are gang members, okay? There isn't 20 million illegals in this country. That's an imaginary number. But there's probably even less now, because, you know, whoever was illegal probably left the country already in fear of getting caught. And even though that might sound good to the MAGA, okay, some of these people might have left even knowing they weren't criminals, but they just fear getting picked up by ICE, okay? And that might please MAGA more. But that goes to the thing. Are we now living in a fascist country? Because I think this proves right there that we're living under fascism. When a leader of a country can just point his finger at somebody and say deport them, and they do it without any fucking due process, without any fucking trial or whatever, you know, that we're supposed to have in this country, to skip all that and just grab you and take you out of here, that's fascism. I mean, that's what Hitler did, right? Round up all the Jews, you know, send them to the camps. I mean, that's what Trump's doing here. And he's playing footsie here with the president of El Salvador. You know, he's probably got a fucking deal with him, probably paying him, giving him all kinds of money to do what he's doing down there, to take these people off his hands, okay? But I'm telling you, you know, what they did was a big fucking, what they call damage control in that briefing with the El Salvador president and Donald Trump. That was damage control, because they knew legally they were in the wrong. They knew legally the courts were against them. 13 federal judges and the Supreme Court all agreed that man has to be returned home. But Trump's not going to do it. He doesn't want to do it because he doesn't want Garcia to come back and tell us how those prisoners are being treated down there. Okay? Because he remembers how that went for the people that we put in Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. Okay? And how they were waterboarded and everything to get information out of them. And the American people did not like that. They did not like that at all. Especially when that picture come out about that one woman here from in the, I guess the Army or Marines, whichever, and how, you know, she was fucking around with the prisoners. Okay? When that got out and went to, I mean, that was what killed that whole fucking self-righteous attitude we had in this country about getting terrorists. We were finding out that we ain't being so very discriminating, very discriminating here about who we're taking off the streets of Iraq and all that. Okay, we're just grabbing anybody that sounds like a terrorist or looks like a terrorist or might have a friend who's a terrorist. You know, we're just taking them all. And that's not how you do things. That's not the way America is supposed to operate. And as the Supreme Court tried to tell Trump that, as the federal judge that the Supreme Court is backing, who also told Trump, okay, he's ducking, running for cover, hiding behind, you know, the president of El Salvador, dodging questions from the press. All this is indications that he knows he fucked up. He knows he fucked up. They already admitted they did. And you know, he's trying to stop this from snowballing into a much bigger problem. And that's unavoidable. Because Garcia is not the only one who's down in El Salvador for no good reason. He's not the only one. There's a lot of people down there right now in that fucking prison that shouldn't even be there. But we're probably never going to see or hear from any of those ever again. In fact, I would not be surprised if Trump in some fucking way tells the president, you know, I'll pay you just to get rid of those people down there. How, you know what I'm saying? That's exactly how low he'd go. He'd probably find some way, you know, to, you know, motivate that guy to, you know, say, tell your guards, you know, kill him, you know, get rid of them, get all of them, just kill them all. Okay. You might think I'm being, extreme in my opinion here, but let me tell you something. Up to now, things that Trump's been doing have been extreme in a lot of ways. He's already hurt a lot of Americans here at home. Okay? And these people that got rounded up and deported on airplanes here, that's nothing. to him. Those people are nothing. Just like, all the folks that he turned his back on after that January 6th insurrection. Okay? They meant nothing to him. Okay? Hey, those people could have got shot. If there was enough people to protect the Capitol that were armed, it could have gone bloody. And you think he would have cared about that? No. Hell, a lot of the people that he pardoned that were rounded up in that January 6th incident ended up back in prison because of other crimes that they were, waiting trial for. Okay, but they were doing their time on that insurrection. When they got out, some of them got in trouble legally and now they're back in prison. Others went to the trial that they were supposed to have and now they got an extension on their time in prison. These people were the dregs of society. Okay? That's more than enough reason why Trump didn't care about them. Okay? He pardoned them just to say, oh, here's a thank you. Okay? But he's not going to pardon them for all the other things. All right? So, like I said, what happened here with Garcia is a tragedy. And yes, there are people who think that Trump did right here, but that's only because they don't understand the details of how we got here. Okay? They don't understand that Garcia was not meant to go to that fucking prison. He wasn't supposed to be sent there. They admitted it was a mistake, but now they don't want to give him back. Okay? And Trump's going to do everything he can to make sure that this guy never sees a fucking camera or the light of day. He's going to live and die there now. And I don't know what to say to the families that have lost someone already. Because if you're going to fight a guy like that in court, you're all going to have to come together as a group. And it's going to take a lot of money, to go after the government here on this. Okay? And if you think you're going to get him in trouble where he's going to go to prison, I wouldn't put any hope to that, okay? Because he's good at staying out of prison. The best you can hope for is financial compensation. Don't expect that any of these people are ever going to be returned to you, because that's the last thing Trump wants. He doesn't want anybody blabbing about what went on down there or what happened to them when they were picked up. And, okay, they don't want the horror stories to come back. Okay, these people are there to stay. So, anyway, that's it. So, I'll talk to you guys later.